Hello, everyone, and welcome to Divide and Conquer. We're named as such because of our intent. What is our intent? Well, we are a group of sport and performance psychology consultants at Fort Polk, Louisiana, and we also fall under the Army Resilience Directorate. You can find them on Facebook and Twitter at Army Resilience. So each episode, we pose a question or issue related to resilience and or performance enhancement that we as a group will conquer through our individual answers. And you'll find out pretty quickly our perspectives and stances tend to be the same, but today might be a little bit different. Anyway, we hope you enjoy our takes on today's question, which is, why does optimism have a bad rap? Before we tackle today's question, I'm going to introduce everybody. My name is still, currently, Diego.
Woo-hoo-hoo.
And then here with me, I have Coach Jess.
Hey!
And Coach Marius. John is busy doing other trainings, so he can't join us today. I thought I could talk a little bit about maybe what the common perception is for a lot of people regarding optimism, because I think it's equated to looking at a glass and seeing it either half empty or half full, and I think that's too simplistic. But at the same time, people also view optimism as like everything is, fine and dandy regardless of what's actually happening, and that seems to be also too simplistic, which almost everything in this world is not that simple. There's so much gray, but I think either a combination of those two or either one of those two beliefs about optimism seem to have a more dismissive connotation, I think, by a lot of people, meaning that people tend to just say, you need to be more optimistic, or tell themselves, I need to be more optimistic. But it's what does that really mean? I think people just say it and hope that the positive effects of optimism will somehow naturally transpire after saying that to themselves or to other people, without really getting into any of the specifics as to what it means to be optimistic or really actually optimistic. This explanatory style versus seeing everything in the most positive light possible. And I would wager that would be the most, pervasive view of optimism to those who have not been exposed to any research or practical skills involving optimism. And, hopefully we can shed some light for those who are not fully aware.
Diego, you started off with the idea of this glass half full or glass half empty. And I remember we were doing a resilience training, one of the MRT courses, and one of my colleagues, Brett Sandwick, I'm going to quote what he said, which I really thought was a nice way of changing that perspective of either, oh, you see a glass is half full or half empty. He said it doesn't matter whether it's half full or half empty. What matters is, are you able to refill the glass? Are you able to find a way to fill yourself back up when you start to deplete? Do you have hope that you have the skills, you have the ability, you have the support when you start draining your glass, that it's going to get refilled? I really like that. I thought that was a unique way of seeing that saying that we say pretty often that distinguishes, people that see a glass one way, they must be pessimistic, or, when people see the glass this way, they must be optimistic, versus seeing no, it doesn't really matter. What matters is, what are you going to do with your glass once it starts to deplete in general? I thought that was a nice, very proactive, and that's the way that I think optimism maybe gets left behind. Is optimism isn't something that just you are, you aren't, or it's just this elusive thing, we should all be positive. But rather, I think of optimism as I'm being proactive about my surroundings. So if the surrounding today is not good, it's, things aren't going well for me, I can acknowledge that. But then I also can start putting into practice or putting into play my way to work through the difficulties that I'm facing. I think that's optimism to me. So I'm facing whatever it is I have, but I'm also hopeful I can change the future to better my situation. Or if things are going well, cool, that's awesome. Let me also put into play ways to maintain the goodness that I'm experiencing. So just a very realistic picture of what's going on and knowing I have the tools and skills. And if I don't, I know where to seek those tools and skills out.
I think the realistic aspect of it is incredibly important, because if people have a bad idea of optimism or struggle with optimism, I think a lot of it comes from the thought that you can't have negative emotions, you can't have negative thoughts, and that makes optimism almost impossible, because naturally when something happens that we weren't expecting, we don't like, goes against our expectations, we're going to have the negative thoughts and feelings pop up, right? And so that realistic part is allowing those emotions to happen, accurately assessing the situation. Okay, I might have these thoughts about it, but then believing that you can be proactive, believing that you have the ability to do something about it. Whether it's huge, whether it's small, whatever, just you have the ability to impact that situation. And so I think for most people that struggle with the idea of optimism, it can come from this thought that, hey, I'm not allowed to have negative emotions. I'm not allowed to have a negative experience. I have to always be looking at the positive. And that's really, really hard to do. I think if we remain realistic, it's like, okay, you're going to have emotions. You're going to have a thought about what's happening. At that point, can we accurately assess the situation? So if we just keep riding those negative emotions and thoughts, yes, that's where we get into trouble and optimism becomes very difficult. But if you allow yourself to initially have whatever emotions come through, you notice what thoughts you're having, but then you're still able to accurately assess the situation. Where is my glass? Where's that level? And then looking at that next step of like, okay, now that I know where the water level is, what do I do about it? So I think it's adding on to that realistic piece of negative, positive emotions, totally fine. You're a human being. You're going to have them. But what do you do after that?
It's so interesting because people in the before the common era already had an idea that was extremely similar to what you just mentioned. And it's, as far as I can remember, as far as I know, it starts with the Stoics. And Stoicism seems to get a bad rap because, similar to what you mentioned, Marius, that people conflate Stoicism or confuse Stoicism with being a flat board when it comes to reacting to a situation, whether it's positive or negative. That you need to maintain some flat affect so that way you're showing and proving not only to yourself but to other people you're not letting the situation get to you. When in reality, the Stoics figured out a long time ago, particularly with starting with Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, we're all human, as Maria said. Like, let yourself feel things, but how are you going to handle the situation after the fact? And how are you going to handle these feelings in terms of, are they going to help you in this situation? Or are they going to do something other than help? Are they going to hinder something in between? I also don't want to conflate Stoicism with optimism at the same time, because Stoicism it's not the exact same thing. But there is a big emphasis and element of being realistic in the face of both tough and, easy situations, so that the outcome you're able to influence a bit more that's in a productive manner, as opposed to living and perceiving bad situations through the lens of a victim, whether or not it's justified in that case. But at the same time, that's where optimism can play a big factor in all types of outcomes besides one specific isolated situation, isn't it? It's like people who have a optimistic explanatory style tend to just have an overall better life satisfaction than those who do not. Their health outcomes tend to be a bit better than people who do not share the same optimism. It seems to be worth it to have and adopt or work towards an explanatory style versus, letting your thoughts and feelings take the reins as opposed to your own agency, autonomy, however you want to call it.
Some of that can be because when we see what we would call an optimistic person, we tend to see them in action. We tend to see these positive emotions that they might have about the situation. What we don't see is that prior to getting into action, they might have had an emotional breakdown where they're like, I can't believe this has happened to me. They might have some of those thoughts of victim mentality, but they got through that and then they sprung into action. And then we see that, and it's easy to say, oh, that person is just positive all the time. When behind closed doors, they had their moments. They had dark moments where it didn't feel great, or they weren't sure about what they could do, but they were able to turn that around. And what's dangerous for us on the outside is if we see these people that we think are optimistic and we relate that to the idea of, well, they're having positive emotions all the time. They're taking action all the time. And we're not seeing the behind the scenes of what's truly happening.
We only see what people choose to show us. So if someone wants to relay the message that they're strictly positive, then more often than not, that's what we're going to see. And whether or not that's the true life that someone's living, we may never know. So I think it is important to bring up that point so that way we don't fall into the trap of social comparison, particularly on social media. Because social media is an even more refined highlight reel of people's lives. It can be easy to be like, oh, this person has an amazing life, which will then in turn drain your cup more often than not. And if that happens and you don't have the resources or ability to refill it, it's much harder to adopt that optimism.
This idea of you can't have negative emotions, I think, is definitely pervasive in our society and our culture of it's not okay to feel any particular way if it's not positive. And that, to your point, Marius, I think that's a fallacy. I think that's dangerous to not explore those emotions, because if we can see them as data, not as these directives, as Susan David, she's a researcher on emotions, and that's how she explains it's data. It's information for you to use. And again, she goes back to what you mentioned, Marius, of if you then can see your emotions as data, now I can then do something with it. It's really helpful for me to realize when I have negative emotions, that's explaining maybe something that means something to me, something that I am passionate about. And then positive emotions, same thing. They have their place. They're explaining something for us. Now, this idea of not explaining the process that someone goes through, so an experience happens or they are in this place in their life, and now there's this journey or this process of going through maybe a very wide range of emotions, and we don't talk about, oh man, in this particular section of time, here are the emotions I was feeling. They weren't good in the sense of they were negative emotions, but they drove me to this next phase. Here's the things I did. Here are the things that I can now control. And then that progression. So Marius, you mentioned that the progression forward, and we tend to see optimists taking advantage of the situation to better, again, their circumstances, or to better themselves in a particular adversity or whatever the case may be. So I guess maybe a question for you all would be, do you think that because of how fast life happens, and because we've been very trained to react rather than be proactive, that potentially the reason why people are less optimistic is because we're in reaction mode so often? And when you're in reaction mode, you're not then being proactive. You're not able to see how things are going to get better. You're just trying to handle and put out the fire right now. And you can use like maybe an army situation or different things that you've seen with the population that we work with, if that's helpful. But I was just kind of mulling that over as y'all were discussing.
It seems to me that a lot of the reactions and the stuff that I hear from soldiers is that much of the training that they're tasked to do with us seems to be on the much more reactionary measure as opposed to a proactive one. And then we hear things like you're talking to the wrong people, or this goes deeper than just us. And I think those reactions are symptomatic of constantly being in that reactive mode, which, I mean, if you heard those things on the basis that we do, at least, you can start to see the explanatory style that these people have, which to me seems to be much more of a pessimistic explanatory style as opposed to optimistic. So it seems like it's almost cyclical in nature, and it just keeps feeding into, when I say it, I should say the perpetual reactionary state seems to feed into that pessimistic explanatory style, which then makes it infinitely harder to break out of that and go more towards a realistic optimism. I don't know how to work around that on a systematic organizational level, but I mean, we do what we can.
I think of the different levels. So I think of maybe at an organizational level and then at an individual level. And so if within your organization, whether it's Army or anything, if at that level a lot of things are done in a reactive way, it can be hard to have that optimism that even if you can accurately assess the situation, even if you can manage your emotions in a proper way, you might not have the belief that something can be done about it, right? Because the organization tells you have to do this way or you're going to be put in this situation. And so I can see how that would bleed into your beliefs and views at an individual level. And that's very difficult. I do think then to the individual, and I would challenge them to look at what can they control and what individual differences can they make, and start thinking of it as optimism at your individual level, because I understand there's going to be a lot of pressure from maybe an organizational level that would completely naturally and understandably push you towards a pessimistic mindset. But within your own little bubble of your individual life, what are steps that you can make? What are steps that you can do? What are things that you can control to maybe make the situation just a little bit better? And that will still take managing emotions. That will still take accurately assessing the situation. But it's hard, right? Because that pressure will be there. But if you can start to separate that from an individual level and an organizational level, it might give you the hope that you can still be optimistic.
I think you both make great points, solid points on the impact that your environment can have over time on how you perceive the world around you, how you perceive how much control you actually have. And unfortunately, that's something that would be really difficult to overcome, like you're saying, Marius, of having to be deliberate every day in seeking out where is the control that I have, even if it's very small, to ensure that I am still getting that balance of, while this may not be ideal or reactionary, but I do have some control that does provide me some hope, be my own agent, to use your terms, Diego, of my own life, and have some freedom and some ability to kind of manipulate my own life in the ways that I choose. I don't know, it's just interesting because I think that if you get reactionary, it's hard to think besides in the past. Like, you're dealing with the past choices that your organization or other people or you made, and you're never really looking to the future. And that just feels to me like it would be very difficult to have sustained optimism because you've practiced one way of thinking that's very pessimistic or not really allowing you to work ahead. You're always kind of behind the curve.
Story of my life.
Jess, your last comment of if we've been almost trained in this sort of reactionary way, we're going to be stuck in quite a pessimistic view. To take a more optimistic view of this is that might be us just reacting to this reactionary style, right? So it's not a deliberate and intentional training of your mind. It's just, hey, I've had to deal with a very reactionary organization or reactionary events, and I'm always a step behind, and that's maybe why now I tend to think pessimistically. Maybe it's because I'm a very optimistic person, but I would say that the hope is that if you're able to train deliberately and intentionally to be proactive, to try to accurately assess the situation, manage those emotions, and look at what you can individually do to impact the situation in an effective and productive way, you can start battling back against that training that was not deliberate, right? So yes, you might have fallen into a more pessimistic way of thinking, but there can be a way out, but it will be deliberate, it will be intentional, it will take a lot of effort, but the hope is that that effort outweighs maybe that situation that you've been stuck in. Does that make sense?
And that, to me, that sounds like that undoing effect that we talk about with the MRT, content and language, but on a much deeper level. I mean, you're changing the default way you respond, and ultimately that's going to take a deliberateness, a willingness, tons of effort. Even if it seems simple, doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be easy. But to me, it makes sense that once you're able to get out of that reactionary perpetual state in a meaningful and impactful way, that the explanatory style that is your default can also become changed over time.
I'm over here trying to think through how you would put into practice in those moments where, yes, things are reactionary. My default maybe is to also then react to the reaction. And maybe it would be finding people who are very proactive, finding people that can ask, that you can almost collaborate with or ask questions to, that would help you, yes, have that undoing effect where I can start thinking more creatively so we can move forward. And that might require outside help rather than just sitting with my own thoughts. If I've not trained my brain to shift into a different mode. So if I'm very reactionary, maybe the amygdala is clicked on, in the amygdala meaning I'm seeing things as a threat. And so fight or flight's really kicked in. So I'm really just very reactionary, that system in the brain of it's reflexive, versus moving towards more of I need to find a way to be creative. Prefrontal cortex comes in. I'm open to suggestions. I'm open to, creating connections with people and moving forward and being able to turn on that optimism and relying on that optimism of I'm hopeful, here's where I have control. And so that might really be tapping into someone who's doing this successfully and figuring out and asking them questions of like, how do you get yourself to a place where you can think critically? Can you help me work through that until I have that default mode is now I can do that for myself.
So with that practical application piece in mind, yes, we're all optimistic that this episode has helped people become more optimistic.
Wow.
Full circle.
Thinking about my thinking, metacognition.
I think it was like metacognition at this point.
Something.
Metacognition squared. But with everything said, we hope there's at least a few nuggets of information that can be helpful for anyone listening to this. And with that, we will say goodbye until the next episode.
Bye! Bye.